Welcome to Disaster Tales. No more sleep today, boss. No more sleep today, boss. So I just scored this absolute trash night guard gig at a creepy, broken down psych hospital sitting right off the highway in the middle of nowhere. The whole place smells like straight bleach, dirt, and misery. The shift guy, some tired dude named Marcus with sunken eyes like he hasn't slept since '95, didn't even bother giving me a tour. He just slapped a heavy metal flashlight and a massive, noisy ring of rusted keys into my hand, gave me this cold dead stare that made my skin crawl, and dropped two completely insane rules before hopping in his truck and peeling off into the dark. Ward C is under maintenance. If you hear noise, banging, or someone calling your actual name in there, it's just trapped air bouncing around the old pipes. Don't touch the handles, don't open the locks, and whatever you do, do not look through the door slot. The second his taillights vanished down the road, I literally burst out laughing. I was like, yeah, right, classic first day hazing crap to mess with the new guy. I kicked back in the guard booth, popped open a game on my phone, and figured I'd just chill and collect easy money. The place was dead quiet, and the first 2 hours went by super smooth. I was thinking, easiest paycheck of my life. Then 1:30 a.m. hit, and everything flipped. The temperature inside the booth instantly plummeted, I could see my own breath fogging up in the air. Out of nowhere, this annoying click-click-click sound started echoing from the ceiling directly over my head. Not like house settling or vent noise. It sounded like someone dropping glass marbles, one by one, straight onto the floor tiles above me. Click, click, click. I dropped my phone, cold sweat breaking out on my neck. The clicks were slow, steady, and literally pacing in a circle right above my chair. I swallowed hard and yelled out, "Yo, who's up there?" "Maintenance." Zero response. Just the slow, deliberate dropping of marbles above my head. I grabbed the flashlight, flicked the beam on, and stepped out into the hallway with the keys jingling at my waist, completely oblivious to the utter nightmare I was walking into. The central corridor stretched out ahead of me like an endless concrete esophagus, swallowing the pale yellow beam of my flashlight before it could hit the far wall. The air out here was thick, choking on decades of dust and chemical disinfectant, and every breath burned my lungs with a raw, freezing bite. I walked slow, my boots slapping way too loud against the linoleum, the heavy ring of keys jangling like a death rattle at my hip. The marble dropping sound had stopped the second I left the booth, replaced by something infinitely worse, a wet, rhythmic dragging sound echoing from the far end of Ward B, like heavy canvas or something much heavier being dragged across rough floorboards. My throat felt completely dry, swallowed by a sudden, choking panic that made my pulse hammer in my ears like a war drum. I forced myself forward, sweeping the flashlight beam across rows of peeling patient doors, each one marked with faded, scratched-out numbers. When I finally reached the heavy reinforced threshold of Ward C, the massive iron deadbolt looked slick with dark, viscous moisture, and a low, human-sounding exhale hissed faintly from the narrow brass slit of the door. I dragged myself up the concrete stairs, the heavy metal flashlight beam shaking in my hand like a cheap leaf. The second-floor hallway was long, narrow, and smelled like damp copper and wet plaster. A single fluorescent light flickered at the far end, buzzing like a pissed-off hornet before cutting out completely, plunging the corridor into total darkness except for the thin circle of light from my flashlight. To keep my nerves from completely shattering, I pulled out my phone and brought up the security camera app to check the live feeds while I walked. That's when my chest tightened up so bad I couldn't even catch a breath. The feed was lagging, hard. There was a full 2-second delay between real life and what was popping up on my screen. I'd swing my left hand with the flashlight, wait 2 seconds, and then watch my hand swing on the dim display. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at the screen. In real life, I was standing completely still in the dark hallway. But on the phone screen, 2 seconds behind my real-time position, a tall, impossibly thin shadow slid right out of the darkness behind me. It didn't have clear features, just 2 hollow sockets for eyes and arms that stretched way past its knees. It stepped right up to my back, leaning down until its face was less than 2 inches from the back of my neck. My blood turned into straight ice water. Goosebumps erupted all over my skin as I felt an actual wave of freezing air hit the bare skin on the back of my head. I whipped around in real life, swinging the heavy flashlight with everything I had, ready to crack somebody's skull open. Nothing. The hallway was completely empty. Just bare concrete walls, peeling paint, and cold air. I looked back down at the phone screen. The delayed video showed me swinging the light at empty air, while the dark figure just stood there, tilting its head sideways like it was laughing at me. I backed up against the wall, my heart pounding against my ribs like a jackhammer, realizing that whatever was in that hallway with me wasn't showing up in real time, it was hiding in those 2 stolen seconds. The screen flickered violently, the battery indicator dropping from 80% straight to 0 in a single blink before the phone died completely, plunging me into a blind, suffocating blackness. Without the faint blue light of the display, the absolute dark of the hospital felt heavy, almost solid, pressing against my eyeballs and stealing the oxygen right out of my mouth. I fumbled frantically with the heavy iron keys at my waist, the metallic clatter sounding like an explosion in the dead silence of the upper floor. My fingers were shaking so violently I could barely grip the flashlight switch, clicking it on and off in blind panic until the bulb finally sparked back to life with a weak, dying yellow glow. I didn't dare look behind me again. I knew instinctively that if I turned my head in real life, whatever was lingering in that 2-second shadow gap would finally close the distance. The air around me suddenly grew thick, greasy, and heavy with the metallic tang of fresh warm blood, coating the inside of my throat with every terrified gasp. My shadow, cast long against the wall by the dying flashlight bulb, detached itself for a split second, twisting its spine backward in a sickening crunch before melting back into my heels. The floor beneath my boots suddenly felt soft, spongy, as if the aged linoleum had rotted away into a thick, wet swamp underneath, and every step I took produced a sickening squelch that echoed down the black corridor. From somewhere deep inside the abandoned administrative wing, a heavy metal filing cabinet drawer slid open on rusted tracks with a long, metallic shriek, followed immediately by the sound of bare, dirt-caked feet sprinting at full speed straight toward my position in the dark. I didn't wait to see what was rounding the corner. I turned on my heel and bolted down the hall, my lungs burning as I sprinted blindly into the dark. The rapid slaps of bare feet echoed right behind me, gaining ground with every single stride, closing the gap in the pitch black. My heavy ring of rusted keys slammed violently against my thigh, the deafening jingle cutting through the sound of my own ragged, panicked breathing. A bony, ice-cold hand grazed the back of my jacket, scraping against the fabric with a sharp hiss. I threw myself forward through the heavy swinging doors of the stairwell, slamming the reinforced steel shut behind me just as a massive impact crashed against the other side. Panic slammed into my chest like a freight train, making every breath feel like inhaling broken glass. I bolted down the stairs, my boots slapping against the cold concrete as the jingling of those stupid iron keys echoed off the walls. The clicking noise from the ceiling had stopped, replaced by a heavy, wet dragging sound echoing from the far end of the ground floor. It was coming directly from behind the reinforced steel door of Ward C. I tried to force my feet to turn toward the front exit, but my body completely locked up as a faint, muffled sound filtered through the iron mesh slot of the door. It was the sound of a small child sobbing in the dark. Every instinct in my brain was screaming at me to break the glass, jump out the window, and run straight into the desert. Instead, like an absolute idiot, I took 3 slow, hesitant steps toward the door, shining my flickering flashlight beam directly onto the rusted handle. The crying stopped the second my shadow hit the metal frame. A low, raspy whisper crawled out from the dark slot, sharp enough to make my stomach drop into my shoes. "Hey man, you forgot to lock your living room window before you left for work tonight." My knees nearly buckled right then and there. "And your little sister is sitting all alone on the couch watching TV right now." The voice wasn't just a child's anymore, it was shifting, warping into a hollow, metallic rasp that vibrated inside my actual skull. It started listing off hyper-specific details about my apartment, the color of my front door, the exact brand of cereal sitting on my counter, the crack on my bedroom mirror. The air around the rusted iron frame suddenly turned rancid, thick with the choking stench of old dust and rotting insulation, making my eyes water and my throat burn. A sharp, jagged pain flared across the back of my neck, feeling exactly like cold, invisible fingernails dragging slowly upward toward my hairline, testing the skin. My pulse was hammering so violently inside my ears that the sound drowned out everything else, turning the silence of the hospital into a roaring, high-pitched static. If I turned around right now, I knew there was nothing behind me except empty air and shadows, which somehow felt infinitely worse than knowing something was hunting me. The heavy steel door groaned under an unseen weight, vibrating so hard against my boots that I could feel the cold iron humming through the soles of my shoes. This wasn't some echo in the old plumbing, and it sure as hell wasn't a hallucination from lack of sleep. Whatever was sitting inside that pitch-black room knew my name, knew my family, and was just waiting for me to lose my mind and turn that rusted key. Then something scraped against the other side of the door. Once. Slowly. Then again, harder. I watched the handle twitch downward by itself, and every muscle in my body went rigid. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't blink. The flashlight slipped slightly in my sweaty hand, its beam trembling across the door as another sound came from inside, a faint, wet inhale, followed by a whisper directly against the metal. "He's standing right behind you." My blood turned to ice. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. A second later, something exhaled against the back of my neck. The breath was warm. Far too warm. Every hair on my arm stood straight up as a faint pressure settled against my shoulder, like someone had leaned forward until their face was inches from mine. I could hear a slow, uneven breathing behind me now, each inhale dragging through the silence, getting closer with every second. My hand began shaking so badly that the flashlight beam jumped across the walls, revealing nothing but empty corridor and long, crooked shadows. I backed away from the iron door of Ward C, my chest heaving as I scrambled backward toward the admin office. I needed to call the cops, call the supervisor, call anyone with a weapon and a brain. I slammed the office door shut, threw the deadbolt, and flipped the heavy desk chair under the knob to wedge it tight. The room was freezing, smelling like ancient cardboard and damp mold. I lunged for the heavy black landline phone sitting on the wooden desk, snatched up the receiver, and shoved it to my ear. Nothing. Not even a dial tone, just a static, metallic hiss that sounded like somebody breathing softly into an open microphone miles away. Desperate for a cell number, I grabbed the massive, dust-covered paper logbook sitting on the desk and yanked it open. My hands were shaking so bad I tore the first 3 pages just trying to flip through them. I skipped past decades of faded handwritten shift notes, looking for the emergency contact page at the back. My thumb caught on a page stamped with red ink, the exact same date from 1 year ago tonight. I stopped scrolling. The handwriting on the page was jagged, aggressive, and pressed so hard into the paper that the pen had nearly ripped through. 2:15 a.m., security guard Miller failed to report in. Checked Ward C, outer lock breached from inside. Flashlight and keys found on the floor inside the cell. Ward C welded shut from the inside. Guard Miller missing. Do not open under any circumstances. My heart slammed into my throat. Attached to the corner of the log entry with a rusted paperclip was a laminated ID photo of Guard Miller, the poor bastard who disappeared on this shift a year ago. I held the flickering flashlight beam over the photo, leaning in close. My blood went completely cold. The face staring back at me from the yellowed plastic wasn't a stranger. It was Marcus, the sunken-eyed, hollow-faced supervisor who handed me the keys in the parking lot 2 hours ago and told me it was just air in the pipes. For several seconds, I couldn't move. I stared at the photograph, waiting for my brain to correct what my eyes were seeing. Maybe the light was distorting the picture. Maybe exhaustion had finally pushed me over the edge. I blinked once, then twice, but Marcus's face remained there, trapped beneath the scratched plastic. The same crooked mouth. The same deep shadows beneath the eyes. The same tiny scar beside his left eyebrow. My stomach twisted violently. I lowered the flashlight, then raised it again, terrified that looking away would somehow make the photograph change. It didn't. The office suddenly felt impossibly small, the walls seeming to press inward as I realized I had been alone with someone who supposedly disappeared a year ago. Then the landline hissed. I froze. A faint clicking sound came through the receiver. 3 clicks. A pause. Then 3 more. My breathing stopped. It was the exact same rhythm I had heard coming from the ceiling earlier. I slowly pulled the receiver away from my ear, but the sound continued. It wasn't coming from the phone anymore. It was coming from underneath the desk. I looked down. Nothing was there. Just darkness. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep staring at the photograph, but something had changed. Marcus was no longer looking straight at the camera. His eyes seemed turned slightly to the side. Toward something standing just outside the frame. My pulse began pounding again as I tilted the photograph closer to the flashlight. There, reflected faintly in the plastic behind Marcus's shoulder, was the outline of a person. Tall. Motionless. Watching him from the darkness. I jerked the photograph away from my face. The office door creaked. Not loudly. Just enough to make me realize the deadbolt was still locked. I stared at the knob as it slowly began turning beneath the pressure of something on the other side. My hands went numb. The chair wedged beneath the knob trembled against the floor. Once. Twice. Then stopped. For one horrible second, there was complete silence. And then someone whispered through the crack beneath the door. Don't let him see you. I couldn't tell whether the voice was Marcus's. Or mine. I backed out of the admin office, my boots sliding across the cold tiles as I squeezed the heavy iron keys until my knuckles turned white. The office door I had just wedged shut exploded outward with a sickening crack, with splinters spraying into the dark like shrapnel. The building's main power grid blew out completely. Every flickering emergency light died at once, plunging the entire facility into an absolute, suffocating darkness that felt heavy enough to choke on. The clicking noise wasn't coming from the ceiling anymore. It was coming from everywhere. I flicked the mag light switch frantically, but the beam was dying, weakening into a dull, bloody red glow that barely cut through the shadows. The air inside the hallway turned razor thin, cold as a meat locker, pulling the breath straight out of my lungs. Up on the ceiling, right above my head, I heard the wet, heavy slap of bare feet. Something massive and contorted was sprinting flat upside down across the concrete panels, its joints popping like snapping dry firewood with every single stride. I raised the dying flashlight beam toward the ceiling, and my heart nearly burst out of my chest. It was Marcus, or whatever had taken his skin. His limbs were stretched impossibly long, bent at backwards, unnatural angles, his hollowed-out face twisted into a wide, unnatural grin that split his jaw straight to his ears. His eyes were pure, glossy black, reflecting the tiny red ember of my flashlight. He dropped straight down from the ceiling, slamming onto the concrete 3 feet in front of me with a bone-crushing thud. The sheer weight of the impact rattled through the floorboards, throwing me flat onto my back. The iron keys flew from my grip, skidding into the dark. Before I could scramble away, an invisible, crushing weight slammed down onto my chest, pinning me to the floor like a bug under a boot. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. I could only watch through the dimming red light as the massive, reinforced oak door of Ward C at the end of the hall started to strain. The rusted iron bolts screeched in agony. The heavy wood groaned, cracked, and then violently exploded outward into the hallway, shattering into a million sharp fragments as a torrent of freezing, pitch-black mist poured out of the open vault, swallowing the hallway whole. The darkness reached me before the mist did. It crawled across the floor in thin, twisting fingers, curling around my boots and climbing over my legs as if it knew exactly where I was. I fought against the invisible weight crushing my chest, but my muscles barely responded. Every breath came shorter than the last, and the harder I struggled, the tighter the pressure became. Then I heard footsteps inside the mist. Slow. Bare. Deliberate. They stopped beside my head. I couldn't see anything, but I felt something lean over me. The temperature dropped so violently that my teeth began chattering. A smell filled my nose, wet earth, old blood, and something horribly familiar. Then a voice whispered directly beside my ear. My own voice. Don't look at me. My eyes squeezed shut. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then I felt a finger slowly trace the outline of my cheek. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And somewhere inside the black mist, something started laughing with my voice. The sound grew closer, circling me without footsteps, until I could no longer tell whether it was coming from the hallway, the ceiling, or inside my own head. Then the pressure vanished. I sucked in a desperate breath and opened my eyes. The mist was still there. But Marcus was gone. Only the keys remained on the floor beside me. And they were slowly turning by themselves. I stared at them, unable to understand what I was seeing, while the metal clicked softly against the concrete with every rotation. My hand reached toward them before I could stop myself, but I froze inches away when the keys suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard a faint metallic jingle. Another set of keys. Coming closer. One step at a time. I lay there on the cold, shattered tiles, my ribs cracking under that invisible, suffocating weight as the pitch-black mist from Ward C rolled over my body like liquid ice. My lungs were screaming for air, burning with the stench of ancient dust, copper, and rotting wood, but every time I opened my mouth, the freezing shadow seemed to slide straight down my throat, locking my jaw tight. Marcus, or the contorted, long-limbed nightmare using his face, was hovering mere inches above me, his jaw completely unhinged, hanging loosely against his throat while those glossy, pitch-black eyes stared straight down into my soul without blinking once. He didn't grab me, he didn't bite, and he didn't strike. He just leaned down until his breath, reeking of stale earth and dead winter air, washed over my face, his voice vibrating directly against the base of my neck. Thanks for taking the shift, boss. The moment those words hit my ear, the crushing pressure on my chest vanished instantly, and the dying red beam of my flashlight finally flickered out, plunging the world into a silent, absolute blackness where I completely lost consciousness. I didn't wake up in the hospital, and I didn't wake up in a police station. I woke up at dawn, sprawled face down in the freezing dirt on the shoulder of the desert highway, 2 miles away from the facility, covered in cold sweat and dry mud, my fingers bleeding from where I had apparently clawed at the gravel while unconscious. A local minibus driver spotted me stumbling along the edge of the road like a hollow shell of a man, pulled over, and shoved a warm bottle of water into my shaking hands without asking a single question. probably assuming I was just another drunk who got dumped out in the desert. I didn't go back to the guard booth, I didn't call the agency to ask for my final paycheck, and I didn't even go back to my apartment to grab my clothes. I packed a single duffel bag, blocked every number associated with that town, and took the first long-distance bus heading straight out of the state. I thought moving 600 miles away, changing my phone number, and taking an easy daytime warehouse job would put an end to the nightmare, but some doors, once you stand in front of them, never fully close again. It's been months now, and physically, I'm fine, no scars, no broken bones, no police record. But the real horror didn't stay behind in that desert hallway, it settled deep inside my brain, right behind my eyes. Every single night, without fail, whenever I sit alone in a quiet room and the room goes dead silent, my vision suffers that exact same, terrifying 2-second delay. I'll reach out to grab a glass of water on my nightstand, and 2 seconds later, my eyes will catch my hand moving on a lag. And in those 2 stolen seconds between real life and what my eyes are seeing, out in the peripheral shadow of my living room corridor, I can see the pitch-black, ruined doorway of Ward C stretching endlessly down the hallway of my own home, with Marcus standing right at the edge of the dark, waiting patiently for my next shift to begin. At first, I convinced myself it was exhaustion. Then I started noticing other things. Sometimes I would wake up with my bedroom door open when I clearly remembered closing it. Sometimes the glass of water beside my bed would be sitting several inches away from where I had left it, and I would find damp footprints on the floor that stopped abruptly before reaching the hallway. I stopped sleeping with the lights off. It didn't help. The delay became longer. 2 seconds became 3. Then 4. One night, I stood completely still in front of my bathroom mirror, staring at my reflection while counting silently under my breath. I raised my hand. My reflection didn't. I froze. 1 second passed. Then 2. Then my reflection slowly lifted its hand. But it didn't copy the movement. It pointed behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My entire body locked up as that familiar cold breath touched the back of my neck, exactly where Marcus had whispered to me inside Ward C. And from somewhere behind my shoulder, I heard the faint metallic jingle of iron keys. Then my own voice whispered from the darkness. "Your shift isn't over, boss." It was pouring absolute buckets, thunder rattling the thin glass panes of the front office like a sledgehammer, when the heavy wooden door of the orphanage nearly got kicked off its hinges at 2 a.m. sharp. I jumped out of my creaky chair, dropping my lukewarm coffee onto the desk, and ran to unbolt the latch before whoever was out there broke the glass. I swung the door open, expecting some drunk driver or a stranded motorist needing a tow truck, but instead, I was staring at a soaked police officer standing under the flickering porch light, his yellow raincoat dripping rainwater all over the welcome mat. Standing right beside his mud-stained boots was a little kid, a boy, couldn't have been older than 6 or 7, wearing drenched, oversized clothes that hung off his bone-skinny frame like a trash bag. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his skin was a sickly, pale gray, but the thing that made my stomach instantly turn was his eyes. They weren't scared, they weren't crying, they were completely dead, glossy and hollow, like somebody had scooped out his soul and left an empty shell behind. "Sorry to dump this on you at this hour, lady," the cop panted, wiping rain and sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. "We got an anonymous welfare check call for a residential unit down on 4th Street. We kicked the door in and found this kid sitting dead center in the living room, in a locked apartment that's been sealed up by court order for over a month." I blinked, looking from the cop down to the boy, who hadn't blinked a single time since the door opened. "Where are his parents? Did you run his name through the system?" "Kid hasn't uttered a single word since we loaded him into the cruiser," the officer said, his voice dropping into a tense, uneasy whisper as he looked over his shoulder toward his running police car. No ID, no records, no family coming forward. Social services told us to bring him here for temporary intake until the morning shift rolls around. I reached out, gently wrapping my hand around the kid's small, freezing wrist to guide him inside out of the storm. His skin felt like a block of ice pulled straight out of a freezer, no pulse fluttering under his skin, no heat, nothing. I grabbed the clipboard from the front counter, logged the intake time as 2:08 a.m., and since he didn't have a name, a badge, or a single piece of paper on him, I scribbled down a temporary tag on his wristband, child number 9. I led him down the dimly lit hallway toward the temporary intake bedroom, his wet sneakers making a wet, sickening squelch, squelch, squelch sound against the old linoleum floor. I opened the door, turned on the bedside lamp, and sat him down on the mattress. He didn't move, he didn't lean back, and he didn't even look around the room. He just sat rigid on the edge of the bed, staring straight at the blank white wall across from him, his hollow eyes reflecting the yellow lamplight like a pair of marbles. "Get some sleep, kiddo," I whispered, pulling the thin blanket over his shoulders, though every nerve in my body was screaming that something about this boy was fundamentally, horribly wrong. "We'll sort everything out in the morning." I shut the door, turned the key in the lock just to be safe, and stepped back into the hallway, completely unaware that the storm outside was nothing compared to the nightmare that had just walked through the front door. I stood there for a few seconds with my hand still resting on the doorknob, listening to the rain hammering the roof. Something about walking away from that room felt wrong, like I was leaving a door open inside my own head. I forced myself to move, but after only 3 steps, I heard a faint sound behind me. A soft knock. I stopped. I looked back at the bedroom door. Nothing. I waited, holding my breath. Another knock came from inside. This one was slower. 3 seconds passed. Then a third knock. My stomach tightened as I stared at the locked door, suddenly remembering that the boy hadn't made a single sound since arriving. I walked back and pressed my ear against the wood. Silence. Then I heard breathing. Not the shallow breathing of a sleeping child. It was slow, deep, and unnaturally steady. I pulled away from the door, my heart pounding, and checked the key in my hand. It was still locked. But from the other side, something gently scratched the wood. Once. Twice. Then stopped. I whispered the boy's temporary number without realizing it. Child number 9. The scratching immediately returned. 3 quick strokes. Then the boy finally spoke. His voice was so quiet I almost missed it. "You're not supposed to lock me in." I felt every muscle in my body tense. I hadn't told him I locked the door. And the hallway suddenly felt much longer than it had 30 seconds earlier. I forced myself to walk away from the intake room, but my heart was doing a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs the whole way down the corridor. I needed to do my 3 a.m. rounds. The orphanage was huge, old, and full of drafty corners that always felt like they were watching you. I hit the main dorm room, my hand hovering over the handle for a second before I shoved the heavy oak door open. The air inside the room was thick, smelling stale like a sealed basement, but the silence was the worst part. It was the kind of dead, suffocating quiet that feels physically heavy. I flicked the light switch, and the overhead fluorescent bulb buzzed to life, revealing the rows of bunk beds. Every single kid in the room was wide awake. They weren't talking, they weren't fidgeting, and they weren't even blinking. They were all sitting bolt upright in their beds, necks craned back, staring dead-eyed at the ceiling in absolute, agonizing unison. It looked like a hive mind, a mass of 30 small, pale statues drained of every ounce of childhood innocence. My stomach dropped into my shoes, but then I saw him, child number 9, sitting smack in the middle of the floorboards, legs crossed, back to the door. He was holding a ragged, stained doll that looked like it had been pulled out of a sewer. I watched, frozen in the doorway, as he slowly, methodically wrapped a thick, frayed strand of black thread around the doll's neck. Pull. Every single child in the room, all 30 of them, sucked in one sharp, synchronized, choked breath at the exact same millisecond. Twist. They all exhaled, a ragged, metallic rasp that sounded like one single, massive pair of lungs dying. I couldn't scream, I couldn't move, I just watched the back of that boy's head as he tightened the thread again, and the entire room convulsed in that same, horrific, shared gasp of air. I felt my own lungs tighten. Without realizing it, I stopped breathing. The room seemed to notice. Every child suddenly turned their eyes toward me. Not their heads. Just their eyes. 30 pairs of pale, terrified eyes slid sideways until every gaze was fixed directly on my face. I could feel the blood draining from my cheeks as I stood there with my hand still wrapped around the doorknob. Then child number 9 tilted his head. Slowly. Too slowly. The doll remained perfectly still in his lap. "Don't breathe," he whispered. My chest burned. I hadn't taken a breath in several seconds, but now the instinct to inhale became unbearable. My throat tightened as panic started climbing through my body, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding inside my ears. Then the children inhaled again. All 30 at once. The sound pulled the air out of the room so violently that my shirt fluttered against my chest. I stumbled backward. They exhaled. The fluorescent light flickered. In the darkness between each flicker, I could swear the children were getting closer. I blinked. They were still in their beds. The light flickered again. Closer. My fingers dug into the wooden doorframe as I fought the urge to run. Something was wrong with my eyes. Something was wrong with the room. I kept telling myself that, because the alternative was too terrifying to accept. Then I noticed the doll. Its tiny stitched mouth was moving. Barely. Just enough to open and close with every synchronized breath. Pull. 30 children inhaled. Twist. 30 children exhaled. The doll's head slowly turned toward me. My stomach dropped. It had no eyes. But somehow, I knew it was looking directly at me. Child number 9 stopped wrapping the thread. For the first time, he began to turn around. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But my legs refused to move. His face appeared inch by inch over his shoulder, and I saw the same dead, hollow eyes from the intake room. Then he smiled. Not like a child. Like someone who had finally found what he had been waiting for. Behind him, all 30 children inhaled at once. And this time, I felt my own lungs move with them. I didn't think, I just reacted out of pure, unadulterated terror. I lunged forward into the center of the dorm, shoved through the freezing, motionless kids like I was pushing past concrete statues, and grabbed child number 9 violently by his bony upper arm. His skin felt like dry leather stretched over frozen iron. The moment my fingers locked onto him, the 30 kids on the beds let out one final, sharp, synchronized gasp that sounded like a collective death rattle, and then they all collapsed backward onto their pillows at the exact same second, going completely limp and still. I dragged child number 9 out of the dorm, my boots skidding on the cold linoleum as he let his legs drag behind him like a dead weight. I slammed the dorm door shut, bolted it from the outside, and hauled him all the way back to my private staff office at the end of the long corridor. I threw him into the heavy leather armchair behind my desk, slammed the office door, and turned the lock 3 times. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely keep my grip on the door handle. "What the hell did you just do in there?" I screamed, my voice cracking, high-pitched and hysterical in the tiny room. "What is wrong with you?" He didn't answer. He just sat in the oversized chair, his tiny frame dwarfed by the leather, his little head tilted slightly to the right, staring through me with those glossy, pitch-black eyes. The ragged doll was still gripped tightly in his pale, dirt-caked right fist. I turned my back on him for 3 seconds, just 3 seconds, to grab a glass of water from the dispenser in the corner, trying to stop my heart from bursting out of my chest. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was a sharp, screeching sound, like a nail being dragged forcefully across a chalkboard. I spun around so fast I spilled cold water all over my boots. Child number 9 was standing up on the armchair. He wasn't holding the doll anymore. He was pressing his right index finger flat against the painted plaster wall, using his fingernail like a cold chisel. He was carving into the wall. Deep, jagged grooves cut through the cream-colored paint, down to the gray plaster underneath, spraying white dust all over the desk. I looked at the jagged letters he had just gouged into the wall. "You are not going home tonight. Hey! Stop! Stop it right now!" I yelled, taking a step toward him to grab his arm again. Child number 9 slowly turned his head toward me. He didn't turn his shoulders, just his head, twisting at an unnatural, sickening 90-degree angle toward his left shoulder. A smile began to spread across his face. It wasn't a child's smile. It stretched far too wide, peeling his pale lips back until his gums bled, splitting the skin at the corners of his mouth. Then he opened his mouth, and the voice that came out didn't belong to a 7-year-old boy. It didn't belong to a human being. It was a deep, resonant, booming adult voice, raspy, wet, and heavy, vibrating through the wooden floorboards beneath my feet, rattling the glass mug sitting on my desk. My mom made that exact same face when I wrapped the thread around her neck. The air in the office instantly vanished. A smell like burnt copper and ancient sewer water flooded my nostrils, so thick I choked, gagging on the back of my tongue. I backed away until my spine slammed into the closed door behind me, staring at this tiny, contorted body making a sound that felt like it was tearing through the fabric of the room itself. My hands searched blindly behind me for the doorknob, but my fingers kept slipping against the cold metal. I couldn't stop staring at him. The boy remained perfectly still, his head still twisted toward me, his smile frozen in place. Then the chair creaked. Just once. The boy hadn't moved. I looked down. His feet were no longer touching the floor. They were hanging several inches above it. My stomach turned as the armchair slowly rocked beneath him, even though there was no wind, no movement, nothing that could have caused it. I tried to swallow, but my throat felt sealed shut. Then the scratching started again. Not from the wall. From inside the desk. 3 slow scratches. I felt my heart stop. The boy's smile widened. And in a voice barely louder than a breath, he whispered, "She heard it too." I slammed myself against the office door, twisted the lock frantically, and scrambled out into the hallway, shutting him inside. My chest was heaving so hard it felt like my ribs were going to crack open. That deep, booming voice was still echoing inside the bones of my skull, vibrating through the cold linoleum under my boots. I needed the truth. I needed to know what the hell the police had actually dragged into this building. I sprinted down the narrow basement stairs, the air getting colder and thicker with every step until it smelled like damp earth, rusty iron, and rotting paper. The basement archives were a labyrinth of rusted metal shelving and water-damaged cardboard boxes containing decades of intake records, police reports, and abandoned files. I grabbed the heavy brass key from my pocket, unlocked the wire mesh gate of the Restricted Records section, and started tearing through the drawers marked for the local precinct. My fingers were trembling so bad I kept dropping the folders, paper cutting my palms as I threw yellow documents over my shoulder. Where is it? Where is the 4th Street file? My hand hit a thick, dark red binder buried at the very back of the bottom drawer. It was tied shut with faded black string, dust caked so thick on the cover that I had to wipe it away with my sleeve to read the handwritten label. The address was there, 412, East 4th Street. I ripped the string off, opening the binder right under the single buzzing bulb hanging from the basement ceiling. The first thing that fell out was a series of glossy, black and white crime scene photos. My knees nearly gave out right there on the concrete floor. The photos showed a completely ruined apartment, furniture smashed to splinters, walls gouged with deep, frantic fingernail scratches, and thick black thread wrapped dozens of times around the bedposts, the door handles, and the light fixtures. I turned to the primary incident report, dated exactly 10 years ago tonight. Officers breached the locked premises following reports of a foul odor. Found female victim deceased in the master bedroom, strangulation via industrial thread. Secondary search revealed the body of her 7-year-old son, locked inside the bedroom closet from the outside. I swallowed hard, my eyes scanning down the page to the forensic examiner's notes. My blood turned into straight liquid ice. Medical examiner report: the child was not a victim of the suspect. Forensic evidence confirms the child committed the act before locking himself inside the closet. Cause of death for the child: severe dehydration and starvation, 10 years prior to discovery. Stamped across the bottom of the page in faded red ink were 4 words that made my heart completely stop beating. Case closed, unclaimed corpse. A cold draft blew through the basement, instantly killing the hanging light bulb. Darkness swallowed the room whole, and from upstairs, coming straight through the concrete ceiling above my head, I heard the faint, slow scratch, scratch, scratch of a fingernail digging into plaster. I stopped breathing. The sound continued above me, slow and deliberate, each scratch followed by a long pause that made my skin crawl. I stared into the darkness, gripping the binder so tightly the edges dug into my palms. Then I heard something else. A soft dragging sound. Right above my head. I backed away from the ceiling, my shoulder hitting one of the metal shelves. The entire rack shuddered, sending a tiny rain of dust down over my hair. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. I looked down at the photograph still clutched in my hand. The closet door in the picture was covered in black thread. But there was something written into the wood. A name. I raised the flashlight on my phone, hands shaking violently as I brought the photograph closer. The name was mine. My stomach dropped so hard I nearly vomited. Then, from somewhere behind the shelves, a child's voice whispered through the darkness. You weren't supposed to find my file. I turned slowly. Nothing. Just rows of empty shelves disappearing into blackness. Then the basement door above the stairs slammed shut. The sound echoed through the entire archive. I heard the lock click. Once. Twice. And from the other side of the door, something began scratching at the wood. Exactly 3 times. The slow, methodical scratching on the basement ceiling suddenly stopped, replaced by a sound that made my skin crawl, a chorus of blood-curdling screams erupting from every single wing of the orphanage above me. I didn't think. I scrambled up those damp basement stairs 3 steps at a time, my boots slipping on the slick concrete until I slammed through the heavy wooden door into the main corridor. The entire hallway was engulfed in absolute chaos. Thick, black, sulfurous smoke was billowing out from under every bedroom door, a suffocating haze that smelled like rotten eggs, burning copper, and scorched skin. But there was no fire. No heat, no orange glow, just a freezing, unnatural ash that stung my eyes and choked the breath straight out of my lungs. Inside the locked dorms, 30 kids were pounding wildly on the heavy oak doors, their fists making a frantic, wet thumping sound against the wood as they screamed in pure, unadulterated agony, "It's tightening. It's tightening." I stumbled down the hallway, gagging on the smoke, my hand reaching out to grab the master key set from my belt, but my feet froze in place at the entrance to the main hallway. Child number 9 was standing at the far end of the corridor, bathed in the sickly yellow flickering of the overhead emergency light. He wasn't sitting anymore. He wasn't even moving like a child. As I watched in horror, his spine began to snap and pop like dry pine branches being broken over a knee. His neck stretched upward at a grotesque, impossible angle, his limbs elongating, pulling his arms down until his pale, dirt-caked fingers brushed flat against the linoleum. His shadow didn't lie on the floor. It stretched straight up the wall behind him, crawling across the plaster, reaching all the way to the ceiling like a massive, spidery stain that swallowed the light hole. He tilted his head back, his jaw dropping so far down it nearly unhinged, revealing a cavernous, pitch-black void where his throat should have been. The deep, booming adult voice tore out of him again, vibrating so hard through the floorboards that the glass window frames at the end of the hall shattered into a million sharp fragments. Everybody breathes when I pull the thread. The locked doors of the dorm rooms didn't just rattle, they began to warp inward, the heavy wood bowing under an immense, invisible pressure as the screams inside reached a deafening, hysterical crescendo. Whatever was attached to that boy was consuming the whole building, pulling the very life out of every living thing inside it. I couldn't move. My hand remained frozen around the master keys while the screams continued to hammer through my skull. I watched the shadow above child number 9 stretch another few inches across the ceiling, moving independently from his body, as if something enormous was crawling toward me from inside the plaster. Then every scream stopped. All at once. The silence hit harder than the noise. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow, and somewhere beneath it, a faint clicking sound. Click. 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 The master keys in my hand began to move. Not because I was shaking. Something was pulling them. The metal rings slowly stretched toward the boy, trembling between my fingers as though an invisible thread had been tied around them. I tried to let go, but my hand wouldn't open. Child number 9 lowered his head. His black eyes found mine from the other end of the corridor. Then his shadow smiled. I felt something tighten around my wrist. A thin, invisible line pressed into my skin, getting tighter with every heartbeat. I looked down. There was nothing there. But a red mark was slowly appearing around my wrist, circling it like a piece of thread being pulled tighter. The boy raised one pale finger. The mark tightened. Pain shot up my arm. And from behind every locked dorm door, 30 children whispered the same words at exactly the same time. She's next. The emergency lights went out. And in the darkness, I felt the thread pull. The deafening screams behind the warping oak doors cut out into a silence. The air in the corridor felt like solid ice, thick with black smoke that clung to the walls like velvet. I couldn't move, my boots were frozen to the linoleum, my chest heaving as I watched the shape of child number 9 tower at the end of the hallway. His limbs were stretched thin, his jaw hanging open like a broken hinge, and his eyes reflecting the ember of the emergency light. He raised his right arm, a limb that looked 5 feet, and held up his hand. Spanning across his long fingers was a strand of black, frayed thread, stretching into the shadows on either side of the corridor like a web. Time to tie the final knot, that voice echoed, not from his mouth, but inside my skull, vibrating against my teeth and rattling my jaw. He wrapped the thread around his thumb and pulled. A wave of force slammed into my chest, knocking me flat onto my back against the cold, cracked floor. The air was sucked out of my lungs. I couldn't inhale, couldn't gasp, couldn't even force a whimper past my lips. My throat felt like it had been seared shut with hot iron. Through my dimming, bloodshot vision, I saw the dorm doors explode outward into the hall, splinters flying as the 30 children spilled out onto the floor like limp ragdolls. They weren't moving. They weren't breathing. They lay scattered across the linoleum, their faces pale, their eyes wide and hollow, locked in that lifeless, vacant stare. This is it, my brain screamed through the rising darkness in my head. He's taking everyone. With the last drop of strength left in my body, I didn't reach for the door, and I didn't try to run. My hand scrambled across the floorboards, scraping against splinters until my fingers locked around the master key that had fallen from my belt when I slammed down. I didn't try to fight the creature. I raised the key with everything I had left and jammed the tip straight into the center of the boy's shadow on the floor beside me, the place where the black thread seemed to anchor itself to the ground. I drove it down with all my weight, dragging the metal hard across the concrete subfloor. Snap! The sound echoed through the building like a rifle shot ringing out in an empty canyon. The invisible weight on my chest vanished instantly. I collapsed onto my elbows, sucking in a gasp of burning air that made my lungs feel like they were going to burst. The towering, contorted shadow on the wall shattered like brittle glass, dissolving into a cloud of harmless, cold dust that drifted down through the air. Child number 9's elongated body collapsed backward onto the floor, shrinking back down to his small, bony 7-year-old frame in a split second. Around me, 30 kids gasped in one burst of air, coughing, crying, sobbing, and scrambling to their knees as life surged back into their bodies all at once. I scrambled forward on my hands and knees through the dust, my heart hammering against my ribs, and reached the motionless body of child number 9 lying at the end of the hall. He wasn't stretching anymore. He wasn't smiling. The pale gray skin on his small face was gone, replaced by the hollow, dried texture of an ancient, long-forgotten corpse. On his small, delicate wrist, the temporary plastic band I had fastened just hours ago read child number 9, but the skin beneath it had crumbled into fine gray ash. Within seconds, the entire body disintegrated before my eyes, leaving behind nothing on the cold floor except a tiny pile of dirt, a pair of drenched, oversized clothes, and a single, torn strand of black thread that dissolved into dust the moment the morning sunlight broke through the shattered corridor windows. The police came, social services arrived, and ambulances lined the driveway with flashing red lights, but I never gave them a real statement. I handed over my keys, walked out the front gates into the damp morning air, and never looked back. The orphanage was shut down 3 days later. The kids were dispersed to different facilities across the state, and every single record from that night was quietly classified and buried deep in city storage. Physically, the children recovered. But those who were in that hallway know the truth. I moved to a quiet, isolated town miles away, taking a daytime job where I never have to work the night shift, never have to lock a door, and never have to touch a piece of string. Yet, every now and then, when a summer thunderstorm rolls in and the power flickers out, I'll catch myself staring at the baseboards in my living room. And right there in the dark corner, sitting in the silence between the thunderclaps, I'll see a single, fine strand of black thread resting on the floor, tightly pulled, perfectly straight, waiting for someone to pick up the other end.